we're going to get divorced. Like, this is, the end of the world. And you trying to help her by playing into that, say, like, okay, like, what if we get divorced? Like, in my mind, like, that's kind of scary to me, because it was like, okay, what if you guys actually decide to get divorced?
Yeah, for sure.
You know? All right, everyone. Thanks, and welcome to Getting Curious with Mitch. This is part of the Aggie Radio Podcast Network. Today I have some great guests on, good friends of mine, people I've been around for years, lots of close friends and relatives that are mutual between us. But today I have both Hampton and Lauren Delker. So welcome, you guys.
Thanks for having us
Happy to be here.
Totally, for sure. And I think how this came to be, Lauren started an Instagram page not too long ago. What is it called again? It's
Lauren Goes to Therapy.
Lauren Goes to Therapy.
Yep.
And talking about mental health, and I could tell she was pretty passionate about it. And Hampton's showing up every once in a while on these posts, being really open about some struggles that they both deal with, and bringing awareness, I think specifically to OCD, which is Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, right?
Yep.
So Lauren, how did you kind of get this idea or inspiration to start this Instagram page?
I have struggled with OCD myself, and it was a long journey to kind of get the right treatment, get the right diagnosis, all of that, learn the right skills of how to deal with it. And so once I finally did, it was really hard for me to not want to just share it with like anyone and everyone I know. I learned a lot of skills that I feel like can help pretty much anyone, mental illness or not, but also specifically people with OCD. The average time between like onset of symptoms to treatment is between 14 and 17 years.
Wow.
So yeah, I
crazy.
feel like it's pretty important to bring awareness to OCD specifically.
Right.
Maybe prevent someone from having to go a full 14 to 17 years.
Totally. And I know one thing that's pretty unique to your situation is, Hampton, you've had it too since, I think you told me you were diagnosed when you were 15, weren't you?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think I'd be kind of a little bit. So I was diagnosed early on,
Yeah.
but I didn't receive treatment for about 12 years. So there's a kind of a unique thing about that. So when I was about 14, I'd say 14 or 15, I was meeting with a counselor and I had a formal diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, which I feel very lucky for. We recently really got into the nuts and bolts of it. So I feel like I haven't had like that intensive treatment until recently. But yeah, no, definitely that was like, it was kind of Lauren having that experience very recently kind of brought my own concerns or helped me think, like kind of re-engage with mental health in that way. And we both ended up going to a treatment center together to kind of try and take it on. So.
Right. And I feel like most people, if they're like me, and maybe I'm just dumb Mitch, but hearing about OCD, at least growing up, like we'd always kind of joke like, oh, I'm so OCD or whatever. And I think I kind of, in my mind, thought OCD was like, you're like really anal about things being out of place. Like you have 4 pencils on the table and they all have to be in the right place or something. And I feel like some of the things you've described are a little bit different or more than that. So can you share a little bit like what OCD is or like kind of how big of a deal it can be for some people?
Yeah, for sure. So that is part of the reason that it goes misdiagnosed for so long, is that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what OCD actually is. So OCD obviously stands for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. So the obsessions can be about having your pencils in line in the right order, but they also can be about pretty much anything. OCD tends to like attack, they say, the things that you care about the most. So people have what you call an OCD theme, and that can change throughout your life. I've struggled with like disordered eating as a theme. I'm currently struggling with relationship OCD as a theme. And OCD is chronic, so it never goes away fully, but there is treatment to like really reduce your symptoms and make it a much more bearable, livable disorder to live with.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then the compulsive part is where you kind of see that come in with like making the pencil straight or whatever, right? So there's this perceived threat that can be almost anything. And then the compulsive part is like the things that you do to kind of like neutralize that threat. So, and then it's a disorder.
So it sounds like it's very relatable to anxiety. Is that fair to say?
I think so. And one thing, research recently, they used to kind of categorize OCD as a part of anxiety.
Yeah.
That's not the case anymore. But generally speaking, like for us personally, we both have kind of a physiological response of anxiety around things that other people wouldn't probably perceive as a threat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what causes the disorder, or that's a lot of the compulsions around things like, for Lauren, like she was saying, like around a relationship. So maybe, I mean, I'm just going to give kind of a lame duck example here, but let's say we got into a little spat. I mean, for her, that spat is massive in her head. And it's sort of like the end is near, like we're going to get divorced, things are going to end, and it's going to be a catastrophe.
Okay.
Right? And so there's a spike of anxiety. And so those sort of situations, people tend to either avoid or do things to sort of try and control that to make themselves feel better. And that's typically the compulsion. So when you're talking about the pencils, which is a really easy example, right, is like, for whatever reason, having that pencil out of place is just really bothersome. Just to make things neat and orderly, like to feel comfortable, there's like I got to push that pencil in, right? I can't live with that kind of distress. And in this case, or what she's talking about more broadly, is that like OCD, I wish it was like more of like the kind of cute stories that we hear about, sort of, oh, it's just being really orderly, or I just spend a little bit more time making sure things are neat and tidy or perfect. But in reality, what it is, it can be debilitating. So it can take things that Lauren was saying that you care about a lot. So anything that causes like a heightened emotional response. So maybe one thing that I've struggled with quite a bit is it's a theme of OCD, which is it's a moral OCD. Basically, it focuses on, am I a good person or not? So, like, I mean,
also called scrupulosity.
Or scrupulosity. Scrupulosity tends to focus on religious based. So I did something and God is mad at me now. Or, I swore, things are like, I'm damned, basically. So
it's like an extreme form of guilt.
Yeah, it can. The fear is, for those people, including myself, is that you made this mistake and then it kind of compounds on itself. The obsession part, right? So someone might be like, oh, I made this mistake and it made me feel uncomfortable. I shouldn't have done that, whatever. And then you kind of move on with your life. Where the other person, you make the mistake and then you realize you may have done something and you actually get this incredible spike in anxiety and have this physiological response. And it's like, whoa, this is terrifying. I did something really bad and I need to feel guilty, or I need to tell someone about it. That's most common. It's like, I need to go tell someone that I did this wrong thing in order to feel better, which is, in that case, that's the compulsion. I have to go profess it, or I can't ever like make a mistake again, so I have to be really careful about all the decisions that I make because I don't want to upset God, or I just don't want to feel like a bad person. So
Gotcha. It's making me think that I have it, to be honest.
You know what? Everyone we explain this to thinks they have it.
Well, because in my mind, like, I'm an extreme overthinker. Right? Like that's been my weakness. And I think it's particularly with dating, right? Just because like I've been burned so many times that like I'll or like I like, for example, like I hate texting. And it's because I've had so many girls just like ghost me, or just like you see things fizzle out because they're not responding fast. So now, and it's something like I'm working through and I found ways to kind of cope with it. But my first instinct when like people are slow to respond is like, oh, they're not interested. And then I think I've at times where it's unhealthy, like equate that to like your self-worth, right? But then you just like overthink it, right? Because it's just like, okay, what can I do? Like, should I double text? Should I? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
100%.
but I could totally also relate to them, feeling guilty for things, especially like religiously, right? But yeah, that's interesting. I still kind of want to hammer down like what the difference is between it and anxiety, though.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's pretty common. So with OCD, one of the physiological responses you can have is anxiety. So a lot of people with OCD experience anxiety, but also there are people who you've probably also seen like or heard of a similar scenario that's talked about a lot with OCD called contamination OCD. So people like avoiding touching door handles or washing their hands a lot. That's called contamination OCD, and that is more, their response is not as much anxiety as it is like disgust. So not everyone with OCD experiences anxiety. The main difference between OCD and anxiety is that, so with OCD, everyone has fears, everyone has concerns, right? But with OCD, those concerns can become like consuming to your life. And if you're spending more than like 1 hour a day doing compulsions, like avoiding or researching or all these things, then like you might have like periods of time where you're a little more stressed out than others. But for someone with OCD, they're spending like excessive amounts of time doing these compulsions. Also, people who have generalized anxiety disorder, who are like diagnosed with that, their worries tend to like flit around a lot more. So like throughout the day, they'll have 20 different things that they're worried about. Whereas with OCD, it tends to focus on like a theme or two or three. And like those three things are the things that you're like the most worried about.
So it sounds like it can kind of play around or be connected to other mental illness, right?
You can have symptoms of other mental illnesses from having OCD. Like sometimes, like we've both kind of experienced depression as a symptom of OCD as well, because having these all-consuming thoughts can be really draining.
Yeah, to Lauren's point, I think too, like it's a lot of people go misdiagnosed because of the symptoms. So like I go see a therapist because I'm feeling this overwhelming anxiety, which would come from maybe the things that I've already discussed, but that's not the underlying like issue, if that makes sense. So, or I'm behaving as if I'm depressed because of the actual compulsions, like or what's going on in my brain, which is the OCD. And
gotcha.
And I think she hit the nail on the head there too. Is really the obsession, right? So like if the difference between someone with anxieties and OCD, and I don't want to necessarily make a blanket statement because I'm not a therapist, but what I would say is that you're simply like very focused on a specific thing typically. So if I'm super concerned about morality, like there's certain, I'm gonna stay on that thought, like regardless sometimes of like the stimulus around me. I can be out boating and I'm still worried about this thing that I did 2 days ago with, if that makes sense. So it's I'm still replaying that. And one of the things that she mentioned was that what you do is you perform compulsions and it takes up time, and that's a part of it. It's like it actually influences that. One thing that that isn't often discussed is just like the obsession itself, or rumination, which is kind of a fancy term for just continually to replay scenarios, events, your fear. That often can be consuming in the way that you're not focused or present in like interpersonal interactions, or it takes you away from doing things that you like or might even love because you can't keep your head in the present. So that can be a really difficult
thing. So the picture I'm getting is it's more so with one specific thing or theme that you obsess about, and you just like can't stop thinking about it basically, and it'll kind of eat into other important areas of your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because you said it's typically about things that are most important to you. Is that what you said?
Typically, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it really can. So people with OCD can like have different themes throughout their life. So, or even multiple themes at the same time, but it's usually not, like again with anxiety throughout the day, there can be multiple different things that trigger anxiety that they're worried about, but then the next time they like are worried about something else, it like moves to that.
Yeah.
And that can all happen within like a day. Whereas with OCD, it's more like a lot of people when they're younger will experience like they're scared of dying or something like that, or something bad happening to them. But then when they get older and they're like in relationships or they have kids, it moves to like being scared of bad things happening to them, to like their kids. So I think the stage of life that you're in can influence it a lot too. But it tends to be more specific to like one thing.
Interesting.
Or a few things.
And it makes me think too, because it seems like with most mental illness, like a lot of it's typically those things are bad. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's usually those things are bad because they're like extremes of those natural like physiological responses. Like I've heard once, like anxiety like is a natural response that we have that like is good, right? Like someone on, in a war zone battlefield needs to be anxious because like they could die at any second, and be ready. But there's obviously like an extreme where it becomes bad. So it makes me think people to some extent probably experience OCD on like a natural level, don't they?
That's an interesting question.
I think Lauren kind of talked about this a little bit in that. So she experienced what was diagnosed as formerly as an eating disorder, but was kind of more of a symptom of OCD. And what can happen is that you can have sort of a tendency, or might have a period in your life where you've got a fixation or an obsession, and that can sort of exhibit some of those symptoms. But I think that there is a difference between sort of the chronic or like genetic OCD where there's literally what's interesting about this is you can do a CAT scan and you can see the brain misfire. You can actually witness the troubles in communication between different parts of your brain.
Interesting.
And so that's a part of it. And I think what's difficult, sometimes is to distinguish like, well, maybe you are fixated on this thing. Like you were talking about that example. Yeah, you've had some bad experiences in the past. So you have some like built up like, yeah, I'm going to try to avoid that scenario, or I'm going to try and do something to get around this because I don't want that same thing to happen. I think with OCD, what happens is there's like that scenario is like your physiological self is telling you that if that thing that you're trying to avoid happens again, your body is actually telling you like you're gonna die. Like that's the level of anxiety that we're at, and that's kind of what you're saying is like the physiological response is that difference, and that's what causes those compulsions. Because you can imagine if you're flooded with with that cortisol, and you're just like, oh my gosh, what's wrong? You want to do something to push that down, and that's what causes the compulsions. And so you have to, but unfortunately, the more that you compulse, the more opportunities you give for your brain to do the same thing to you over and over and over again. And that's the cycle, which I think Lauren could probably talk about too. So.
I was going to ask too about kind of the diagnosis of it. Like at what point, because you kind of touched on, you can actually do like you said a CAT scan and see like the brain misfiring on that. But I'm wondering like at what point do people say, I better go get this looked at? And you kind of said it a little bit, but I just wanted to.
Yeah. I think that, so in OCD treatment, you actually take this test called a Y-box test, and it measures your symptoms. So, and they ask you like how long you spend doing compulsions each day is one of the questions. And I think like some people are maybe like high functioning OCD, and so that maybe their brain isn't misfiring as strongly as someone else's, and so they more have like OCD tendencies, and so they can be kind of obsessed about something, but they don't spend so much time like obsessing about it or doing behaviors and rituals around it. But if the symptoms are causing you to like miss work, miss school, not be able to like be present in your life and like spend time with friends or family, or you're feeling like you need to isolate, or you just have no energy to like get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
I feel like that's really where I think anyone can benefit from therapy, honestly.
Sure. Yeah.
But if symptoms are really controlling your life like that, I feel like therapy is like a must. But obviously it's a privilege to be able to have access to therapy, and because it is kind of expensive, unfortunately.
Right. And it makes me think too, like it kind of sounds like it's obviously a biological illness, but is it something that can also like be developed or made worse over time? Like I'd imagine seems like it's usually caused through some kind of trauma. Right?
Yeah.
That's a great point. One symptom of PTSD, or like sort of having a traumatic event, OCD follows that a lot of the time. That's actual traumatic events and significant like life changes. For me and my brother and my unlucky family, it like the minute we hit puberty, there it is. And those hormonal changes are really key. So I'm sure you've heard of postpartum depression.
Yeah.
What people don't understand is that a lot of mental illnesses can spark or like begin from those hormonal changes. When we were doing therapy at a treatment center, we knew someone that developed OCD during that time just after she had a child. And so life events like that, trauma, there's a myriad of ways. Obviously it's the old debate, nature versus nurture, but it certainly can be something that you develop. I think you can have a genetic tendency and then something can happen and then it can spiral that way. And I think for me, it was sort of like, I guess I can honestly just say it was like genetic. So the minute it hit, it was there, and then I've kind of never looked back. So
totally, but it also does seem very situational in the sense that like there's things that can like trigger it or like make it feel really bad at times, right? Like because like depression, like people who have like major depressive disorder, they like always have it. Like it's kind of regardless of what's happening in their life. It could be a really good day or like good things happening in their life and still feel like awful. But I would imagine OCD is a little more like there's like some stimulus to it that like triggers like episodes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of like where the cycle comes in. I wish I could like draw you the OCD cycle because I think it would help explain a lot. But what happens is like you have a trigger. Because of that trigger, you have the intrusive thoughts. So like for someone with scrupulosity, those thoughts are like, I'm a bad person or I'm going to hell or whatever, right? For me, like a lot of times those intrusive thoughts are like, oh, well, like the trigger is Hampton didn't give me a hug when he got home from work. Like sometimes it can honestly be something as simple as that. And then the intrusive thought is, oh, well, he doesn't show me enough affection. And then it's so easy to like catastrophize from there and be like, we don't love each other, like what's happening, you know? And like I'm laughing about it because like I've received treatment and like I'm mostly okay, but at the time, like when I wasn't, it was so painful and like those types of thoughts seemed so real. So I kind of like forgot what your question was, but with the cycle, you have that trigger, you have the thought that comes along with it, and then you feel like you need to do something about it. So the urge to compulse. So absolutely, like sometimes the trigger can be something as small as like that, or like sometimes the trigger is something a lot bigger, like a life event or that like actually like brings the OCD onset. And then OCD is a chronic illness, so like you will have it the rest of your life if you're diagnosed with it. But your symptoms at times can be like much less impactful than others, and that's dependent on like treatment. Also, like if you're in a time of your life where you just don't have many triggers or things happening. And yeah, sometimes that cycle can take place in like a matter of moments, and other times that cycle can take place in like over the course of a day or a week. Or so.
And do you feel like the chronic part of it is that like once you have a trigger that you can compulse over that for a long time? Is that kind of the chemical imbalance part of it that like where it just stays there for like longer than it should?
I think so. I think what's different, I think your point about major depressive disorder versus OCD, I think there is truth to that. Oftentimes like there are stimulus really can really like get it going. But my experience has just been like, I don't need a trigger. I like a lot of my stuff is obsessions just are can be is, I mean, I guess it would have to be something, I suppose, to get it going. But once there is a theme that's developed, I mean, it can go on that for as long as it wants, and then it will find something else. And for me, just as it would be for major depressive disorder, everything in the world can be going great. It's the same way, and you can be miserable because because your mind is fixated on anything else. There's a place that you're going essentially that of fear or uneasiness or just sometimes disgust, like even that makes it hard for you to one, be present, but just enjoy life and have like satisfaction. And for me personally, like that looked like, every day in like high school, no matter how the day went, it was still like I would still sort of have like a similar experience. Like every day I'd wake up and I'd be incredibly anxious, and the period between like waking up and getting to school where I'm not talking to anyone was typically the worst, because that just gave me time to kind of obsess.
Yeah.
And so I'm like sweating and anxious, and then I get on the bus or get in the car, and then usually things would die down as I like started to talk to people. But when things are really bad, like you can be in the middle of a conversation and you're still thinking about it. So
right, which is makes it hard to be present, I'm sure. But one thing that made me think that came to my mind, Lauren, because you said that like now, like looking back on the things that you struggle with in OCD relationship wise, like you can look back it seems like you can look back very logically and say, okay, that was like kind of dumb for me to think that it was end of the world because Hampton didn't hug me. Right? Like you can kind of look at that from like take a step back and say, okay, that's not accurate, but it's very real in the moment. Right? So is the difference, it's like is it kind of like your frontal lobe, like decision making part of your brain or logic part of your brain like shuts off when you compulse, and you're just like you're like not thinking clearly almost, or it's just like really emotional?
Sort of, yeah. I don't really know like exactly like all the science behind it, other than the fact that I do know you can do a CAT scan and like literally see like your brain like misfiring.
Yeah.
But what I will say is like sort of what treatment does for you is that you can kind of like liken it to like having like a bee on your shoulder, right? So like before treatment, the bee's on your shoulder, and like you are stressed about that bee. You feel like you have to do something about that bee all the time, 24/7. It's all you can think about. It's so stressful. People will tell you, well, the bee's just sitting there, it's not going to sting you, you're fine. It doesn't matter. Like there's no logic. You still think that bee's going to sting you. Whereas like receiving treatment, the bee is still there, and you can be aware that like the bee is there, and you might be like stressed about it. But you now have the wherewithal to be like, it doesn't matter if the bee's going to sting me or not. I'm still going to live my life. And just, maybe the bee will sting me. Maybe it won't. Maybe it will really hurt. But I'm not going to let the bee control my life.
Right.
Does that help?
Yeah. And because I wanted to drill down into what therapy actually does, because I feel like it would not work for someone to just say, like, maybe Hampton, sees you really stressing or obsessing over this fear, right? And to him, it's like, okay, that is not real at all, right? And it'd probably be very tempting to just be like, Lauren, like, snap out of it. Like, it's not a big deal. Like, relax, right? So whether that be in therapy or between you guys, how do you go about, like, helping that person? Or, like, how does someone walk you through, like, treating you, or a therapist?
I think it's a great point, and kind of hits on maybe a little bit what she was saying at the end there, where it's like maybe it will sting me, maybe it won't, because what we want to do as human beings, if I see someone struggling with a fear that I know isn't like necessarily rational, or it seems like it's like you're worried that this just doesn't seem like the reaction comparative to like the stimulus is like balanced at all. We all want to just be able to be like, hey, like I want to reassure you, I want you to know that that's not going to happen, or the chances of that happening is like so slim. Like, let it go, drop it, whatever, right? But unfortunately, and this is maybe the hardest thing about this disorder, right, is Lauren can talk and be like, yeah, now I see that, and it's funny, and I can laugh, and it's like logical, I can analyze that, but you can't reason kind of with this disorder, if that makes sense. Like, because any ounce of uncertainty that there is, it kind of latches onto. So that's why people who are worried about, let's say you're a hypochondriac, like
Which is what? I don't know.
no, you're fine. You're worried about your like sickness. You're always
Okay.
worried that you're sick, that you have some sort of illness, right?
Yeah.
They're going to see a rash on their arm, and then they're going to go Google it, and then they're going to go to see a doctor, and the doctor's going to tell them, hey, like, it's nothing, it's eczema, or whatever, just let it go.
Yeah.
To that person, even they can be reassured by a doctor, they can be told by anyone, and they can and typically what they'll have is moments of relief after that. They'll be like, yeah, what was I thinking? You know, like, oh my gosh, threat, no big deal.
Yeah.
But it's such a crazy thing that even that reassurance from a doctor or whatever, it won't stop the disorder from doing what it does. You're going to continue to find, well, what if this? What if the doctor was wrong? What if, because you can what if anything.
Totally.
And so the kind of and it seems counterintuitive, but the way to combat that a lot of the time is sort of like not to push away the threat of like, hey, we might get divorced. It's like, let's talk about divorce. Let's get in there. Let's be like, what would happen if that, like, let's talk about the situation. Let's embrace this and tell that this threat, this thing that could happen, like, we're sitting in it, basically, like, it's already happened. We're already like playing it out in our minds.
Yeah.
And we just learn to like live with that crazy distress and just sort of like process and be like, if that were to happen, I wouldn't die. Even though my body's telling me I would die and everything would crumble.
Yeah.
I could handle this. And that's where the exposures come in, is because you're confronting the threat, having the physiological reaction, and pushing on still anyways. And it's more nuanced than that. There's like a lot more than just like running at the thing that scares you, but it can be boiled down a little bit to just simply face the fear and then like train. It's almost like you're retraining your brain to be like, the threat that you thought was so scary, well, we just faced it and I didn't die. I'm going to do it again until my brain really learns that what's on the other side of this isn't nearly as what my body is telling it is. And that's really complex, but that's kind of...
Okay, and I want to drill into that example. So let's say your obsession is relationships, right? And then I just bring this up because I know you guys have dealt with it. So when you dive into this, you know, if Lauren's feeling like, okay, we're going to get divorced, like this is, you know, the end of the world, and you trying to help her by playing into that, say like, okay, like, what if we get divorced? Like, in my mind, like, that's kind of scary to me, because it was like, okay, what if you guys actually decide to get divorced? You know? You know? So, like, how does that conversation go? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to add what he said. It reminds me so much of Dumb and Dumber. Have you seen Dumb and Dumber?
Yeah.
Where Jim Carrey's like, so you're telling me there's a chance? After she was like, yeah, 1 in a million, you know? That's OCD.
Classic
for
scene.
You. But yeah, before treatment, we could not have conversations like that. Like, there was not, the D word was like not something we talked about, which I think for some people, like, who don't have OCD, like, that's okay. Like, we're in a committed, loving relationship, and so, like, talking about divorce sometimes is, like, feels counterintuitive, but we have had to, like, not necessarily to, like, consider and be like, do we want to do this or anything, but just, like, play out, like, what would happen if we did, because by completely avoiding the topic, like, whatsoever, I was training my brain that it was a threat. And confirming to my brain, like, over and over that, like, if I can't say the D word, I can't talk about this, I can't consider this, I can't think about this, I can never feel doubts about my relationship, I can never, like, not find Hampton attractive, we can never fight, none of those things, otherwise the worst is going to happen, I'm going to die, and it's going to be horrible. And so we had to do a lot of work with, like, our therapists. Like, we had multiple, so we each had our own individual therapists, and then we kind of did do some, like, group therapy together with, like, our whole group that we were with at the treatment center. But we had a few sessions with, like, our individual therapists together where we were able to kind of, like, nail down some of those things a bit more specifically. And I think that, like, I mean, I could see maybe someone like listening to this podcast and being like, I have relationship OCD. Oh no, I have to like talk about divorce. And like, I think with no context, that's gonna like probably not go over well.
I was gonna say,
partner.
like I'd imagine probably the first time you had a conversation like that, like diving into that fear, it was probably guided by a therapist.
Yeah, it
Right.
absolutely was. And
Okay.
I don't even remember if we were with a therapist or not, but it was like encouraged by the therapist. We both knew what was happening.
You knew, like, you had kind of like a framework of how to go about this conversation.
Absolutely. And like we learned a ton of, not only did we do ERP therapy, the exposure and response therapy at the treatment center, we also did DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, where we learned a lot of skills of like interpersonal communication and how to emotionally regulate and that type of thing. And so those skills like really enabled us to like have those conversations in an effective way and like they're very intentional conversations. Like we're thinking about what we're saying. We're not just like throwing things out.
And I would say like maybe not always, because that it can be a positive exposure to just like jump into that conversation, just like because half of it is like I want the threat to be as real as possible because I'm approaching it, and that's what's going to make this exposure really good. But yeah, like she's not going to approach to me and just be like, let's talk about divorce, and like unless she was like, hey, I'm doing an exposure, or I'd like to, this is bothering me and I really want to like kind of or it could be, like I said, it really could be just straightforward, but we're going to have a conversation about why she did that. Like exposure, I think she used the right word. It's very intentional, and I would not recommend anyone just like start like jumping like the therapy. Like ERP is a therapeutic like you see a therapist, you have someone help you process that. We do this on our own now. We do the exposure response prevention by ourselves. But you see a therapist and like they help you understand how to do that effectively. But it's definitely like there's lots of real world exposures is what I'd say too, and so you don't planned and unplanned and so. Yeah.
So I think it's a beautiful thing that you guys are so on the same page about that and willing to help each other. And I'd love to dig into more examples that you guys deal with. But I'd imagine if this is something that goes undiagnosed for, you said 15 to 17 years, 14, there's got to be a lot of couples who like maybe one of them discovers that they have it like well into their marriage. And then maybe they have a spouse that's not down to go to therapy with them or whatnot, which obviously you guys are huge assets to each other. So I'm just curious, like, if you're like kind of alone in this, or like your spouse isn't willing to like have these conversations, or I know like dudes are weird and don't like to have deep conversations typically, but what would you recommend that they do? Do they just go to their therapy more themselves, or especially if they can't afford to go to therapy?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is that us both having OCD comes with its pros and cons, because we do understand each other very well. Like we don't have the exact same themes as one another, but we can understand the cycle, we can understand what it feels like. But our OCD can play off of each other. So like if Hampton's struggling with his own OCD, that can a lot of times trigger my OCD, and then we're in a position where we're like both at like a 10 on the like stress level, and we can't help each other, and it can be hard. But for a situation where like only one person has OCD and the other doesn't, we were in the treatment center with a few people who had a situation like that, and it was hard. Like it can be very isolating to have a mental disorder, especially one that's like maybe a bit misunderstood or more uncommon, and feel like no one like understands it, especially like that person that's closest to you. Like you want to feel understood. I think the most important thing is that we're learning the most important skill I learned in therapy was like learning how to like take care of myself, because in a relationship, you need to rely on each other. Like you've chosen to rely on each other. That's why you're together. But I think there's a huge difference between like supporting one another and saying, hey, like while you do this hard thing, I'll hold your hand, versus like, I'm going to do the hard thing for you. And so if you have a spouse who or partner who like won't hold your hand, like that sucks. And like hopefully you can have some conversations and help them understand the importance of doing that. But at the end of the day, like it's you that's gonna
Holding
be
your hand meaning like willing to help you through your struggle. Is
yeah,
that what
like
you
I'm
mean?
gonna
Not
be
like
here.
literally just holding your hand, but
It could be,
it could
but
be.
yeah, like I'll be there with you while you're doing this, and like I'll cheer you on, but like you're the one who has to do it. So I mean, I know couples can like benefit from one person improving, and maybe that other person will follow the example, or maybe they won't, who knows. But
Yeah.
I just think that the most important thing that we can worry about is like ourselves, and making sure that we have the tools and resources to help ourselves so that we can then be the participant that we need to be in our relationship.
Right.
So
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of like what's the air mask principle a little bit in this, where like put yours on first before you help others, right?
Yeah.
And I think in this case, Lauren, I think it hits the nail on the head pretty dang well. Like you can't, as a part of OCD, like learning how to manage it is like the nicest thing you could do for your partner, because that partner, especially if you're, I mean, to anyone who is married to someone that struggles with a disorder, it's like it's hard to understand. I'm sure it'd be really hard to understand. And like Lauren said, you would really hope that that partner would be willing to learn about the disorder, take time to like listen and hear it out, because I don't think it's nearly as scary once you get some information and then you know how to help. And helping doesn't have to be what Lauren says, like something extraordinary. It's simply like being there, like sometimes just like being like, hey, that sounds like that is really, really hard. I'm so sorry you're going through this right now. If there's anything I can do for you, let me know. Like I'm in your corner, but just not going like you can't just start like living their life for them, because the minute you do that, you're a lot of times it's accommodation. You're taking that person's sort of ability to I don't know, get better away from them, I guess. So.
Well, I've heard that's even unhealthy. Like if someone is struggling with addiction, right? Whether it's boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, someone you care about is struggling, and then you make it your problem. So if they're losing or relapse, it's like you feel like it's your fault.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure would suck. And I'm curious too. So it sounded like Lauren, like if you're struggling, you're pretty healthy about bringing it up, saying, "Hey, I'm struggling right now. We need to do what'd you call it, ERP session?"
Yeah, ERP or exposures.
So is that typically how you go about it, or are there times too where it's like, Hampton, you just notice that something's off and you like kind of confront it, or is it almost always she brings it up to you?
That's a great question. Honestly, I'm gonna go back to what we were just saying. Like, there are certainly times where, like, and I'm just happy we're in a super loving, happy relationship where if she saw me struggling, it's like she would be my life raft and like be like, hey, like I can tell that you're struggling like right now, and we could have a conversation about it. But again, you can't take that from that person. And the hardest thing with exposure response prevention is that you're literally just like, it's a really nice way of saying torture. Like, it's a really, really nice way of being like, oh, that's like the hardest thing that you could think like you could do right now. Go do it. And I know all of us confront fear like that, but with someone with OCD, that physiological response, like I said, is that extreme that it really is like, I'm going to do the thing that like the worst thing I could imagine, and I'm going to try and do it on like a daily or semi-daily, like, basis, and that can be really difficult. So getting yourself up to face that fear again and again is hard, and it's going to come with bad days. And so I think it's important for the people, if Lauren was in that situation, to be tender and make sure that I reach out. Or sometimes it is helpful to be like, hey, I've kind of noticed this, but you still can't force that person to make that decision, because ultimately they have to, what's going to be effective exposure is them deciding themselves to like willingly do that. Yeah. And that's is the more detached and the more like, it's an individual choice, that's stronger that, that signal to the brain that this isn't scary. You know, it's the cleaner you can do that, the better, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. So it's like you almost get better at doing it. But I would imagine that there's like you said, it's probably not only hard but exhausting to confront stuff head on like that. At least, like, I know, like, when I'm dealing, like, if I'm really anxious about something, like I told you, like, relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are times, like, where I'd get so anxious that I'm just exhausted at the end of the day. And I haven't even, like, gone to the gym yet, you know, or it's like I've been eating plenty of food. But have you guys really, like, gotten a sense that there's, like, a very real, like, energy expenditure dealing with mental health?
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny, like at the treatment center we went to so we would be there for 3 hours a day, and at the end of the 3 hours, like all of
Holy
us were
cow.
just like, I'm going home and taking a nap because it's so draining. Like, I think just living with it is so draining, but especially like doing the ERP therapy is so draining because there really is that physiological response, and you're just like when you say you can like feel it in your body, like you 100% can, like you can. I mean, if you next time you're feeling anxious, like ask yourself, like, where in my body do I feel this? Is like my chest tight? Is my throat tight? Like, what's happening? And you really are expending energy, like when you're feeling those thoughts. And then if you're like fighting it, you're expending even more energy. So yeah, absolutely. Any form of mental illness can really drain you. It takes up your energy.
And to be honest, that's why I was really interested in talking to you guys, because I'm not diagnosed with any mental illness, but it was like I had one of those experiences where I was just zonked after just like a weekend of like anxiety with the situation I was in. And I was like, okay, mental health isn't just like having a major disorder, but it's like everyone deals with freaking mental health, you know, or is like affected by it. And there's got to be useful ways. Like you said, you'd recommend therapy for almost anybody, not just people in severe situations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the statistics are that like 1 in 5 people will be affected by mental health at some point in their life, and then 1 in 20 are affected by like more severe or like chronic mental illness. But I mean, I really think therapy can do so many different things. Like there's therapy for just like processing difficult things like the loss of a loved one or a breakup or whatever, just processing any sort of difficult thing in your life. But then there's like more specific therapy like ERP for OCD and that type of thing. But yeah, it affects a lot of people.
Yeah,
sure.
I bet.
So,
and for those who have never been to therapy before, I've been a couple years ago for a different situation. But what do they typically do in a therapy session? I'd imagine it varies depending on what you're struggling with. But like you said, the normal human response that you were saying, Hampton, was like to just reassure somebody that like they're fine. But I'd imagine a therapist definitely doesn't do that. Right?
Absolutely.
the good ones don't.
The good ones don't.
No, she's hit that. And it's different. So like when you ask the question, like broadly therapy, like there's so much. There's so much out there. There's for traumatic events, there's EMDR, which is sort of like a method of helping you sort of like process those emotions and then like forget them, like which from a traumatic event, right? And then there's things like ERP, which is that active sort of you're making active choices to confront like threats. And then there's just like your average talk therapy. And I have a lot of experience with that. I did that for not consistently, and to be fair, but like for like 10 plus years, just in and out. When things got bad, I'd go, like once every 2 weeks. And then when things would get better, it'd be like once every 3 months or something like that. So it kind of varied. And so therapy, depending on your disorder, and this is crucial. Like if you have OCD, like talk therapy is, I'm not saying it's terrible, but it really doesn't.
It's not super useful.
It's not super useful.
Because you can't treat it rationally.
You can't, if you don't if you're not doing the exposure, like you're still, because of what it does to you, like you're just confirming the threat. So if you go to that therapist and they are doing, typically, I mean, like even in therapy, they're not just like, I heard someone the other day say that like therapists are like coddling you, which I never experienced that myself. But like I
Coddling is what? Sorry,
coddling, like
dumb
just
Mitch.
treating like a baby and like,
Okay.
oh, everything's fine. Like, and there's some truth to them being like sensitive to people's emotions because it's their job. But
Sure.
the reality is, it's like they're there to help you do some like really hard things. Like, a successful therapist is wanting people to like confront really difficult like things in their lives or grow, and that takes like a lot of hard actions. And I think with talk therapy, it can be a lot of sort of just like, oh, like try and practice these skills. Oh, you need to get this stuff out. You need to talk about it so you can process it emotionally and things like that. And that's great. But again, with OCD, it really, really, I mean, just my personal experience, I can't say this blanket statement, but like,
Yeah.
there's no comparison. Like, ERP was the only thing that allowed me to sort of gain ground in areas of my life that I felt like I had lost to compulsions. So.
And you said ERP is different than talk therapy, and ERP is where you take it head on.
Yeah.
Right. So what's the difference between that? Because in my first thought when I hear talk therapy is like, oh, I just vent everything I'm saying, and then they help me look at it from a rational perspective. Is that similar to what it is?
Yeah, so typically most therapists practice what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and that is a huge umbrella for which a bunch of different types of therapy there are like exist. But it's talk therapy. You're giving people information.
Well, ERP is under talk.
Oh, that's true. You're right. I'm wrong. I'm sorry. Sorry, everyone.
Fact checker here.
Yeah, but cognitive behavioral therapy, like, at least from my experience, like, you're teaching people like how to. We use the word effective a lot. Like, you choose effective behaviors, but you would just say like ones that align with where you're wanting to go, like your life goals, your values, right? Like, I'm trying to live this way, and because I'm anxious because of this, it's preventing me from doing that. And so those, a lot of times that talk therapy is like, I am talking to someone and sort of relating to them the details of what's going on in my mind, and that helps. That helps, one, you as a person, like, just process emotion as you address it.
Yeah.
But two, like, then you get like really helpful feedback from a therapist to be like, oh, like, you have this mental disorder. Here's some things to look out for. Here's ways to like cope that are healthy, and here are things that you can do to, like, you know, when you're having a bad mental health day, like, here's something you can do. And so I think there's more of that. But with ERP, it's a more of an active thing, and like, you literally are just like, let's set up like this, almost like it feels like a little experiment, and like, let's have you do this hard thing, if that makes sense.
So like let's say this example. Let's say Mitch is in a complicated relationship, right? And I'm just stressing. Okay.
Sounds like
so.
real.
And I go
Just kidding.
and I go to, like, say, talk therapy.
Yeah.
If I go there, I tell them every detail of my situation. Is that person typically gonna just like say, like, just look at it from a logical perspective and give me feedback, like, this is how you could navigate this? Or is it more like, okay, this is, I think, based on what you told me, these are symptoms that you're having, and this is how you can treat it?
So every therapist is going to look different, and there's multiple different types of therapists. There's like a CMHC, there's a LMFT. You can look them up if you want.
Yeah.
But they all have different, and there's also like psychiatrists that like focus on the more like medical side of things. Social workers deal like almost only with like none of the medical side of things, and only the talking and working through things. But like, going to a therapy session, again, every therapist is going to look different and have a different way of going about it. And I've had some great therapists, and I've had some not so great therapists.
Yeah.
But for that scenario, yeah, that's mostly what it's going to look like. And
Which one? Giving the coping strategies, or like giving me advice on this relationship?
It can be both, but
Okay.
what I was just going to say is that like, a good therapist is not going to try to influence you to do anything that you don't seem like you want to do. So what I mean by that is their goal is to help each individual live their individual life to the fullest. And like, for some people, that's going to look completely different than like the next person they have in their office. And so you don't necessarily need to like be scared that you're going to go to therapy and a therapist is going to tell you something that you just completely blows your mind and that you did not know about yourself already. Like, you know yourself better than anyone else. You know your life goals, your life dreams, all of it better than anyone else. All the therapist is going to do is like help you like identify those and find the effective behaviors to like accomplish those goals. And they will help you see things that you can't see in the moment. But again, a good therapist isn't going to like make you do anything. Like, they're not going to give you like horrible advice that you're going to regret, right? They're going to help you like make your way through all of the cloudiness to like understand what you want to do. Does that make sense?
Okay. So it's, in a way, they do just kind of rationalize your situation. Like, it's like putting all your thoughts on a whiteboard and showing you, okay, like, I don't know.
Help you process
that kind of right?
it.
Yeah, help you process all those thoughts.
Like, kind of like identify the important thoughts and maybe identify the ones that you should maybe not be giving as much attention.
Okay.
Yeah, I think to Lauren's, it's like they're helping you identify typically things that, ways of thinking about things that could kind of unlock new potential for you to meet your goals. I think that's one thing. Like, one thing is like, I'm sick, I have this whatever disorder, and so they're like, here's more information about this disorder, and from the situation that you're telling me right now, do you feel like this is influencing it? And they can sort of like help you go like kind of come to those conclusions yourself. Like
realizing that you actually have a bigger underlying issue than just like a situational thing. That's a classic example, right? Okay.
Like, I think especially as men, right? It's really like we suppress a lot of that. So it can be sometimes some of my worst days at therapy, to be honest with you, is like going in there thinking you had this small problem and then realizing like, oh, this is like an underlying issue that I've let like fester. But again, therapists are not unearthing. It's not like this magical experience. And I think people do this a lot too, or where it's like, they don't know what's in your head. Yeah. It's not like you're not giving over any sort of like agency to someone else because of, there's a scientific process here, and we're trying to help people get to, what their ideal life looks like in some ways. And I think it's important too. You've said this a few times, and I'm not necessarily trying to correct you, but like, they aren't always, when you use when you say rationalize or logic, like look at this rationally, like that there's some truth to that. But one of the most important parts of therapy is understanding and kind of embracing emotions. So emotional regulation, and we sometimes put people into categories like you're an emotional person or you're more of a rational thinker, right? Yeah. We do things based on both, and it's important that we understand to make like like I think there's plenty of places where your rational mind you'd like to take over a little bit more or whatever, vice versa. But emotional intelligence is a thing, and therapy is there to bring out, to help you understand that side of yourself and use that in your collective decision making. And she's talked a little bit about dialectical behavioral therapy, and that's one of those skills is sort of emotional regulation and using. They use the word wise mind, but we don't realize this, but it's important for us to make decisions not only based on strictly logic or strictly emotion. It's kind of there's kind of a sweet spot where we understand scenarios, what we want, because if we continue to, like, if you suppress emotions, they bubble up other places too. We have to get, that's the one thing, it's they don't go away. Emotions, we all have them. And I think it's important that we understand, like, we learn and we grow and we like talk about both of them so that we can make the best decisions and those typically involve emotional reasoning.
I know one thing that's really kind of resonated with me talking about this. I always get it mixed up. ERP therapy, like tackling your emotions head on. Well, what you just said made me think of that, because I found out firsthand how awful it can be to repress your emotions, like not letting yourself feel something. I mean, all my examples are dating just because that's what I'm in the thick of right now, right? But like a couple months ago, right, like basically went through a breakup, right? And instead of dealing with those emotions, I was just like, okay, busy mode. I'm just going to like freaking keep going. Like, I'm just going to do my thing. I'm going to go out with a bunch of girls. Like I was just like, went hammo. But then like 2 weeks later, I was just like, why am I still freaking thinking about this girl? Like, it's been a couple weeks. Like, I haven't talked to her. Like, I don't know what's happening. And then like there was one night I think I'd just gotten home from another date. Super cool girl, like super attractive. And I was just like, I was like sad because I was just like, oh, I just wish I was with this other person, you know? But then I was just like, you know what? I don't think I've like felt sad about this yet. And it was weird, like, I was like, it was like someone had died, and we hadn't dated that long, but I was just like really cared about that person. But it was just like I needed to like almost treat her like she had died, you know? And like I remember I just went for a drive. I just like said a prayer before I went in. I was just like, I gotta do this. And like my roommate gave me this sad song that I just related to. And like I hadn't bawled like that in like forever, you know? Like it was weird. Like I'd never just like, because I'm not a crier, you know, but just like letting that go, knowing no one's seeing me.
It probably felt so therapeutic.
Oh, it like sucked, but it was like, it hurt so good kind of.
Yeah.
Because it was just like all this pent up like thoughts and like feelings, just like embracing like, hey, yeah, this person like hurt me. Like I gave her my heart and she threw it away, you know what I mean? Just like realizing just feeling the gravity of it. And like it was like kind of felt that way for like 2 days. It was like over a weekend, but like it was like I needed to do that to be able to go forward. And it was like, had I just repressed that, I'd probably still be feeling that way. And I would imagine, you know, maybe I was lucky and realized that, but a lot of people probably don't do that, especially with whether that's OCD or depression, whatever it is. They don't tackle what they're feeling, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like really specifically, ERP is like basically you and your therapist are like identify your threats, your perceived threats, and then come up with like exposure activities that you can do to make that threat feel real, and then like hopefully habituate to it after you've like sat with that threat for a long time and not done the compulsions. But one thing that like everyone should do regardless of OCD or any mental illness or not is processing their emotions. And I think we very much have like grown up in a culture that is kind of like happy as where you want to be, like that's the right thing to do and feel all the time.
Yeah.
But like we've been given all these other emotions to feel, and some of them are like uncomfortable or painful, but it doesn't necessarily make them like bad or something we should run from. And
Yeah.
like you said, feeling them is so important. And like a lot of times you can't move, like the only way past it is through it. Like you can't go around it, you can't jump over it, you have to go through it. And it's scary and hard at first, but once you kind of get it down, like you realize like you can ride that wave of the negative emotion and like sit with it, and just like all your other emotions, it will pass eventually.
Yeah.
And it's really empowering actually to like be able to do that and be like, I felt something that was like so hard and like I survived.
And I'm just thinking too out loud, but like when your body does that or your mind does that, it's an emotional, it's like a natural response to stress, right? Like that's your body's natural way of like coping with something, right? So repressing that, it's almost like preventing your body from doing its job to heal, right? Just like if you were to like break your arm and you just keep opening the wound and you don't let it heal, or cut yourself. I've got that mixed up, but you know what I mean? Like it's like, I'm just thinking, but what does that sound right? That it's like if you're repressing emotion, it's it's preventing your body to like cope and like heal from trauma that it's been through.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one really interesting thing to understand is that humans, we used to so we have the fight or flight response, right? We used to need that like when we were living amongst like lions and tigers and bears. Yeah. And so we needed so we needed this fight or flight response to like, it helped us, it served us because we needed to be able to like fly away or fight this threat. And what's hard is that now like we humans went from like the middle of the food chain to like the top of the food chain like that. yet we still have this fight or flight response like built into us that we don't really need anymore because we're not up against those threats all the time. And so what happens is now we have those threats against like tests at school and like everyday things. And so we still have this like physiological response that we really don't need anymore. But we can't just like ignore it because ignoring it doesn't do anything about it. That's why like they say like exercising is so important for your mental health, because you need to like be burning off all this like extra stress that's like coming to you. And yeah, so I hope that kind of answers. But
and as we're kind of nearing towards the end here, I'm curious on this as well, because I feel like what's very much associated with mental illness is like getting on prescriptions, right? So I'm wondering, because I feel like one of the stigmas that goes through my mind is like, oh, if I go to therapy and acknowledge that I have this problem, I'm going to eventually end up on some pills, and like that's scary to me. So like I'm wondering, like, at what point are people actually medicated for mental health, or like can people have these disorders and treat it without medication?
That's a great question. I would say that there's sort of like an internal debate between
and again, I know you guys aren't experts, but I'm just wondering from your experience, you know?
From my personal experience, so medication is tricky, and I think what's hard about giving this sort of advice is that it is so individual, and it's so personal based on like not only the genetics but circumstances that in someone's life. I do both. I'll just put it that way. So I'm on prescription medication, as well as, you know, I participate in pretty regular therapy. My symptoms are greatly lessened by taking some prescription medication. Just like any other drug that we take, there can be negative side effects. There can be things that are difficult. And I would recommend that people, you know, genuinely kind of explore their options. And this might sound a little interesting. Like, one, people can treat, like, you can truly do exposure response prevention without medication. Me personally, my personal experience was that without the medication, I don't know if I would have been able to successfully perform a lot of the exposures that I did. That physiological response was just so intense that having something to sort of like alleviate that just a little bit gives me more clarity and more ability to face some of those fears.
Okay.
And it's not for everyone. It truly isn't. I think one thing that there is certainly, just like everything else, right? We like to put things in a box or have a stereotype. Like, there are doctors that over medicate. There's plenty of doctors that under medicate. And I would say on this therapy side of things, there's plenty of therapists that will tell you like, oh, just do the therapy. And then there's like psychiatrists that'll just say like, just medicine. But the reality is, like, it's totally up to you. And prescription medication can be a huge benefit in the right circumstance.
Right.
And I think people who are worried that might be the like, that's where they have to go. You have so much agency in this decision. And there's so many different types of medication, and there's different doses as well. You can be on a tiny, tiny dose that like you might not even feel. Like if I took that, I'd be like, I don't feel any different. And I think that's the difference, is that there is no end all be all, and treatment can look a bunch of different ways. I do think exposure response prevention for someone with OCD is the most important thing that they can do.
Right.
But I also would say that there's absolutely no problem with engaging with medication if that's what you feel like is right for you.
Yeah.
I hope people make those decisions based on kind of like the trial and error we do with everything else. Like, this one didn't work. Okay, let me try another one. And don't just sort of like jump to a conclusion and not explore their options because of maybe a stigma or a concern. And that's what's hard, is like you have to just be super open to trying different things. And I know it's painful and it's hard, especially when you're like, I don't really want to be talking about this kind of stuff all the time.
Yeah.
But that's the way to get through it, is being like assured of yourself and just advocating for yourself, as well as like listening to the counsel of other people.
And I would imagine too that like the stigma with mental illness, or people that are kind of insensitive or don't understand, is they think that like you can just treat it naturally, just like, oh, like toughen up, like just go out and do it, like get out of bed. But like I would imagine the place for medication is that there's people that are so severely ill with it that it's like they literally don't have the capacity to do those natural treatments. Like someone who's depressed, major depressive order, like I've heard there's people that will literally can't get out of bed, or like will be indoors for a week at a time or something because they're just literally so in the dumps. And it's like medication is what enables them to have the capacity to do other healthy things like go to the gym and whatnot. I think like what has scared me is because I've seen or been around people who have like only used medication and don't do those other things, and then they're just reliant on the pill, if that makes sense. You know, it's like they might have the capacity even though they're taking the pill, but then they don't do those other things.
Totally.
But I think I'm learning to see that a lot of people just don't have the capacity to treat things or do other things that could help, and medication is what can get them to that point if they need it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's true. I think that if you were going to pick one, therapy is probably the better option.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that medication helps a lot of people to even like be able to do therapy. So yeah.
Why do you say it's a better option?
Just in my experience, at least, I think there are some people who like almost need the medication to be able to do therapy, but the medication, all that's doing is like changing some of your biology, right? So like someone with major depressive disorder, like their brain literally just doesn't like make serotonin, like the happy hormone. And so having a medication that provides that for them is huge. But the therapy is like so important because it's helping you to like learn how to rely on yourself and like to learn like what to do when you feel like crap, and like to learn how to advocate for yourself, to learn boundaries. And that's why I feel like everyone can benefit from therapy, because there's skills that honestly I think should be taught like in school,
right?
For like everyone, because we all need to like to know how to live effective lives and to like understand what effective choices look like, what effective communication looks like, and all of that. So
because it's almost like you're learning from an educated person on how to deal with these things, because you go because there's something you don't know about your illness and how to treat it, right? And I think, and you've mentioned that you guys do kind of therapy sessions yourselves with the skills that you've learned from going to therapy, right? So it's like you guys wouldn't have that skill set and would probably be struggling way more if you didn't do those things, right?
Yeah.
I think where you hit the nail on the head with sort of like, I think there can be a reliance, right? And I think unfortunately there's a stigma. We people like to jump on like the bandwagon of just like, well, therapy, you're just having someone like take care of your problems with you, or you're reliant on this, you're making this bigger a deal than it is, or you're not behaving this way, and like kind of toughen up, like just do the hard things, like they'll get easier, whatever, right? And there is a point where people literally can't do those things, and that's heartbreaking. And what Lauren's talking about is like, we're talking about genuine chemical imbalance in the brain. Like it's a thing that, again, you can see. Like it's not, these are real disorders, just like a broken bone. And if without proper medication, some of those things don't, like you can't just like always like self-help yourself like out of a situation, right? Like as much as we'd like to. But what's hard too is that if you don't make the time to, especially with disorders like OCD, which really take your action to kind of build literally new neural networks that give you different information. The therapist that I see always says, when I'm struggling with something, it's like, go where the new information is. Because with someone who's OCD, right, they're going to go back to the kind of the same behavior. Well, I can do anything a little different, and I learn some new information, and it helps me like process and grow. And so I think what Lauren is getting at is that, yeah, I would agree with her that therapy makes a more of an impact in my life, like, because I have, it allows me to do those things, but, or it allows me to make those really significant changes. Yeah. But what medication does is treats a medical condition to a point where, to a tolerable level where that kind of, you're not just like swimming upstream against like a crazy current. It's just because the real reality with just like any disability or any illness, it's like you're up like the other person's running faster than you, like, or like they're running with the wind at their back, you're running with it towards you.
Yeah.
So anything you can do to give yourself a little advantage is great. And then by going to therapy and doing those things, you can learn ways to keep up in a lot of ways, or whatever that looks like for you.
So it's almost no different than if you had some injury, and you got to be doing things like, there's probably, once you've healed enough, you can be doing workouts on your own, and you learn those workouts from your physical therapist, and then there probably is some kind of pain medication that you take to manage it and make it so you're in a spot where you can even do those workouts, right?
Absolutely.
To do it. It's almost, it's literally no different, other than there's no blood and guts. Right. Well, crazy.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I appreciate you coming on. Like, I've honestly enjoyed this, just because I know it's very real for me, with struggles that I have, and I'd imagine so many other people out there, whether that's with, someone who's diagnosed with OCD or these other major illnesses, or they're just dealing with heartbreak like Mitch. But again, where can people find your page, Lauren, so that they can kind of see the insightful information that you post?
It's just at Lauren.goes.to.therapy.
Okay.
One last thing I just want to say, you did ask a question earlier
Sure.
that I forgot to answer, is just what can people do if they can't afford therapy. There are a lot of like resources online and books you can read that you can kind of teach yourself some of these skills that I would definitely recommend. I can send you a link to some of them. I don't know if you can put them in the notes or something. But
yeah, totally.
But yeah, there's a lot of things you can still do. But yeah, my page, Instagram account has some of those types of resources. So
perfect.
I also just love that I'm doing this right now. I'm going to give a shout out to the OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center. We have referred to them as the treatment center or therapy many times during this podcast. And I think me and Lauren both owe a debt of gratitude to the therapist and the staff there. It's truly groundbreaking work. OCD is not treated kind of as a primary issue in a lot of therapy settings. So for someone to take people on like that and really tackle this issue, it's huge. It's changed my life, and I hope that people do give it a chance. Lauren really aptly put that not everyone can afford this, and I just want to be clear that I'm in a very privileged position to enjoy this sort of help. And but if you do have the resources, I can't stress it enough. Go to therapy, take care of it. There's no reason you can't start living like right now, live your life. I'm one of those examples of people who had let that sit and fester for a long time, not taking the same accountability over it that I could have. And Lauren is a great example of just really seizing on that, because at the end of the day, just like anything else, you have to make the decision to go do it for yourself. So go do it for yourself. That's awesome.
And where again is that? Where can people find that resource?
So it's the OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center. It's in Bountiful, Utah. So
there's one in South Jordan too.
Yes, there's one in South Jordan as well. So they're great. And Lauren mentioned the IOCDF.
The IOCDF is the International OCD Foundation that has a website that you can find all sorts of resources on OCD.
Yeah, so. Great information, which is just as crucial. So.
Cool. And if people want to get involved, is it best to just kind of Google that? And I'll put a link in the description. But can people just Google that, and then they just set up, like, they fill out like an application, or what is that
for the
look
treatment
like?
center?
Yeah.
Yeah, you just get in touch with them, and they set an appointment, an intake appointment for you to kind of see like what your concerns are, and then they will give you like a diagnosis or a treatment plan recommendation, and you can kind of go from there. So.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, guys, for coming on. Any other shout outs, things you guys want to talk about?
Shout out to Mitch and his heartbreak. Oh yeah.
I'm good, guys. I'm just to be honest, yeah, I'm in a good spot. That's just very relevant.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, no problem, you guys. Thank you, everybody. Okay.
Awesome.
Well, guys, awesome.
Thanks, man.
Thank you
That was
so
great.
much. Yeah.
Did we go way long?
No, that was probably like